Alrighty, beautiful humans. Happy Monday. Um, Super exciting. Massimo and we are, I guess we said in the email that invited you to be here today with us. We're going on this like 12-month exploration into the space of what does it mean to be a man in the 21st century? What is masculinity in today's world? How can we connect really to our divine nature of masculinity? And yeah, so throughout last year, Massimo and we've had many, dude, like endless conversation, exploring the space,
Teetering.
looking at like how can we bring men more together, like in a digital space, but then also we're wanting to create 4 retreats throughout this year where we can come together like face to face and really experience like more fully in experiences and medicine ceremonies. Like wow, like what other layers are there to what it means to be a man? And so yeah, through these next 12 months we'll have every Monday a kind of about an hour conversation. So the first 2 this week I'm going to mainly interview Massimo and really introducing him and seeing okay, like what's his motivation and journey. And then next week we'll flop around and Massimo will
I will be the interviewer.
yeah, you will interview me. Yeah. And then in the weeks to come, we're going to explore leadership. We're going to explore like the space of like masculinity, and then we have these 4 P's that we're using in our framework, which is power, prosperity, pleasure, and presence. And so we'll have months where we dedicate them to these individual areas and these subcategories, so that a bit as a frame, like what is this, like why are we doing it? And so yeah, Massimo has been, as I said, he's become a really good friend over the last year. I first got to know him through my partner Emma, and yeah, his work in the world of sexology and tapping into pleasure. How do men and women relate? Like, what are the challenges that hinder connectivity? And so I think what you often speak about and what resonates a lot with me is this piece of relating. Like, why are we relating? How are we relating? And how can we relate in a space that heals both of us more? And I feel that's really where I'd like to step in, is hearing a bit more like, why is that whole relating piece so deeply important to you?
Thank you for that, Toby. It's an interesting question. I guess it's deeply ingrained with this ideology or this idea that I have of masculinity, and I guess in many respects, having a very absent male figure in my life, I wasn't ever really taught how to celebrate life and understand the gorgeousness that life has from a man's perspective. And I think that's something that I've probably journeyed throughout life trying to find, until it was really faced with the situation of recognizing that it was me that had to sort of figure that out. And I think that one of the common features, I think, in therapy that I find with a lot of the men that I work with is exactly that it's we haven't yet really understood that masculinity is that vessel of really thoroughly enjoying life and not be so scripted in what masculinity should be according to society. And I think one of the other components that's very, very important for me is like you said, is this relatability, or relating back into the feminine, and having to create this platform where we can facilitate each other's freedom. I think that's a big component that for me that really screams in the work that I do as well, and trying to understand that, especially in the couples work too.
Dude, I mean, this freedom piece is in my gene keys. I mean, this is like, this is a gene key that actually it appears twice. Once in my life's work, and then in the other component again, like in my prosperity space. And yeah, I feel this, unpacking of becoming free within the partnership. I think it's something really, really interesting. And I think what you touched on as well is this masculinity as the vessel to explore life. And maybe we can unpack this in kind of more depth, because for me, one of my big like prayers at the moment is to just more deeply embody my energy. And what I'm beginning to see, like, yes, previously I thought like, okay, I'm basically thinking about the world, and now it's like, how do I relate on like more cellular levels? And when Emma was speaking about like, yeah, open the heart, it's like, man, I mean, I hear the words, but it doesn't mean shit to me, and now it begins to be like, wow, there's actually some interesting, like, energetic experiences that can be had like way outside sort of like the thinking domain. And talk more about this vessel.
I was thinking about something like this earlier today, actually, where when we kind of go into the masculine cave, we go into nature, we go hunting and fishing and motorbiking, or at least I go motorbiking, and we don't actually realize that space is one where our heart is completely open. We are completely present. We are completely at peace with whatever we are, good, bad, ugly. And I just think that it's a question of, no one's really ever taught us how to sort of relate that back into relationship. I think that's a big component for me, where we already largely have the skill set that's there in knowing how to hold space and knowing how to be present and knowing all these things, like really, really celebrating that space. But it's really knowing how to integrate that back in relation to someone. And I think once you sort of piece those little pieces together, you are far more available for that other. And I think a lot of that has to do with also re-scripting ourselves in thinking that, we don't have to follow those old systemic values that have been placed onto us. I think being also new age men, we can really decide on how that looks and how we want that to really unfold.
I mean, it's kind of like re-scripting is a certainly a big piece. And because I remember when I was growing up, I mean, it was like really like kind of like in the matriarchy, and so it's kind of interesting because I went to Lisbon to House of Beautiful Business last year, and there was a lot of talk about like the patriarchy, blah blah, and it really triggered me. Where it's like, yeah, okay, this is certainly one valid experience, feeling like I grew up in a patriarchy. I think for me it was the other way around, feeling like I grew up sort of like in a matriarchy, like my grandma on my mom's side being really strong. Maybe also because like her husband was blind, so one of my grandfathers, and so she had to be kind of like the strong one. And then it's the same with my mom and my dad being like really subordinate. And so for me, I feel it's that learning of like like how do I actually show up as kind of the leader, but not in a sort of like aggressive way, but in a sort of like co-equal with my partner. Neither sort of like subordinating nor kind of dominating, but being in that sort of like state of continuous equilibrium, or like trying to sort of like find that at all times. And I think that's a big challenge for me. I'm curious to hear your perspectives on that.
Dude, that resonates a lot with me, because I also grew up in a very, 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 I would say, strong matriarchal environment with my grandmother and my mother, my sister. So I guess my familiarity with the feminine is almost hyper, I guess, familiar, where I had to learn along the way really what my masculinity was and how that needed to be unfolded in, I guess, in the way that you're sort of putting it, this dance of knowing how to relate and be present with that feminine force. And I think one of the components that I find that happens with a lot of men that I work with is this idea of shame that happens, or at least unfolds, because we're not allowed to be a certain type of man, or we're not allowed to be, I guess just be in relation. And that was a tricky one for me. It was tricky learning how to navigate that space, because you want to go out, as an example, and explore dating and you're completely driven by your libidinous drive and wanting to engage sexually and all these different things. Whereas the conscientious side comes in, or at least from the feminine comes in, that says, you shouldn't be like that as a man. And then you go completely to the other end of the spectrum where it's like, okay, all I can be is the holder for the feminine, and I can't bring in all these other facets that I guess form part of my masculinity. So for me, it was this massive confusion of knowing where to place myself on the spectrum of, I guess, what we call masculinity. And it's only, I guess, in hindsight is a beautiful thing, that I believe this really, that there's a point in every man's life that we come to where we have to make changes and step towards a state of integrity. And we have to let go of a lot of, I guess, just that urge of penetration, that urge of just wanting to be a stereotypical kind of man, and recognize that we really have far more potential than we actually realize. And going back to that dance that we were talking about before, it's such a powerful place to be in, being able to know how to relate and know how to hold that space, but then equally be vulnerable and be something completely, what I've always been taught as weakness, right? Whereas it's not weakness. It's so powerful in being able to hold that space equally for yourself in relation to the feminine. And that's really where I probably see it as a state of freedom. If you can get to that point really where you embody that, it's incredibly liberating. It's incredibly freeing, because there's no longer any fear of judgment. You are what you are. There's no longer any fear of tapping into that shameful side of us. And all these things that sort of come up are great indicators to work on. You can call it shadow, you can call it shadow work, whatever you like to call it. But I always sort of have this philosophy that whenever there's a state of defensiveness that comes up in us, and it can be in conversation within a group of men, in relation to women, doesn't make a difference. It's a huge indicator that there's something that you have to grow through there. And looking back, I was hugely defensive growing up, hugely defensive. And I don't know if that was something that you experienced, but it was only once I kind of learned how to surrender to really what I am, good, bad, and ugly, that just disappeared.
I feel I'm probably still in that space.
Dude, I think
I
aren't
mean,
we
it's
all?
it's
Though?
really interesting, because there's also this notion of like provocation, and there's I feel there's this piece of really tapping into life force. And what comes through for me more and more is that, because there's a whole bunch of cool things that you touched on, and I want to touch on them again. One thing to just contextualize the last piece is that as a kid I wasn't really allowed to just feel anger and just like be like, like irritated. And so that energy kind of like got frozen a lot for me. Now, what I'm beginning to learn more and more is that like underneath all of it is ultimately like sadness of like needing to kind of like remove part of like who I just wanted to be as a kid. And so now what I'm beginning to see, that moving kind of like through that sadness and that sort of like defensiveness, which comes from sort of like protecting all that sort of nicely packaged away emotions, it's really like alchemizing it through actually, tapping into anger or frustration or and feeling it, but then using it as a force to create something rather than to destroy. And I feel that's sort of for me the big awakening, in that sense, that anger doesn't need to be destructive, but it can be like hugely creative.
Anger is
hugely
powerful. It's hugely powerful, and I think I quite like looking at all these emotions as just energy, and then it's just really a question of where do you place that energy. And rightfully so, like you're pointing out, if it is the creative, you can magnify anything that you're doing in your life. I mean, that's on the back of, I wrote my book on the back of my anger, and I think anger for me was something so would I describe it? Almost detaching from reality, because I was in such a rage for a massive portion of my life. And it was only once I started really channeling that and putting into things, like you say, constructively speaking, that I recognized, okay, it is just a question of just transferring across. And there's something that's quite interesting that's been happening to me lately, where I've been digesting this through a lot of the therapy that I've done, but then equally on my own journeys, using psychedelics and things like that, which as a therapeutic practice, I think is just so important. And it almost seems like massive chunks of my life where I felt I'd completely forgotten because of this cloud of rage. My dream cycles right now, going back into them, and I'm reliving them again, and I'm actually remembering all the things that I went through growing up, which is spectacular, because it almost feels like there's this part of myself that I've missed out on for such a long time because of the pain that I was experiencing and the troubles at that particular time. Call them traumatic experiences. As I've digested these things and I continue to digest them, it's almost like this door just starts getting wider and wider and wider. But then I definitely link that with being able to surrender to all these experiences. There's something so powerful in that word surrender. I, I I don't think there's a particular formula how to do it, but I think we all need to try and figure it out, for ourselves at least.
Yeah, I totally feel you on that surrender piece. I want to go back to the whole shame thing that you just spoke about earlier.
Mm.
I feel that sort of like shame of just like being. I mean, something that resonates in that for me is really I feel that the shame of like being like actually very powerful in a way. And I feel there was something that I felt I needed to disconnect. And so that wasn't, it's like, yeah, being sort of like kind of nice and harmless, but ultimately I feel that there is more. There is the layer of, I think how Jordan Peterson says, like a man needs to be a monster. But then it's the thing, if you have a sword and you can wield it, that's a great capacity. But the question, I mean, are you able to contain that energy and use it, or is it just like kind of like going havoc? And I feel you touched on that whole shame piece, and then sort of like the other facets of you as a man, other than just being a holder for the feminine, which seems to be this very kind of like tame, okay, you hold it, it's fine, you're basically creating the space, but you're sort of like disconnecting from, I think, many of like the creative aspects of like man, and I feel that is also where you said, letting go of like penetration. And the question for me is that, like, what is sort of that higher form, or is there like a balance between kind of like holding and being the one that cuts through the shit and like creates something?
Absolutely, I think we can do both, and I think that feeling full within ourselves, we have to learn how to do both. My statement on penetration is, I think, as men, we get so fixated on sex and the need to penetrate, where I think we're overlooking an incredibly powerful metaphor there, that what is it about our masculinity that we should really be doing in life, and that's penetrating the world on a bigger picture. It's how do you want to penetrate the world? And I quite like that statement, because it kind of makes me think of how do I want to leave a mark on this world and the people that I encounter in life. And there's a real conscientiousness about, I guess, this, once again, this idea of penetration, both in the sexual space and also in the outer world space, because one thing that's often very overlooked is the responsibility of penetration. And for me, it's become so important in knowing, okay, what are the consequences of me just doing the simple act of penetration on a sexual level, but then equally, how am I impacting the world around me by penetrating the world elsewhere? What am I really leaving behind? What is the power in my residue that I'm leaving behind? And that just sort of puts me in a position of just being, I don't want to say hyper aware of relating, but it's probably made me more accepting of how I want to be in all these situations. It's like you point out what Jordan Peterson says as an example, and yes, I think there does need to be a space for that. And I know you do Krav Maga. I've also have my history in martial arts, and having that sort of space where for me, going to boxing and getting into a ring with someone and letting it all out, knowing full well that the recipient is going to hammer me back as much as I'm hammering them. There's a real balancing in that space, and it's based on respect. Ego goes out the window. You are humbled by the experience, but it's consciously choosing to enter that space, not just for the sake of just doing it as a sport or exercise. So there's I guess as I sort of grow within my masculinity, there's a real difference in conscientiousness in all the things that I do. Whereas I think, my younger version, there was really just being oblivious, being kind of aware of it, knowing full well what it was, but not yet having stepped directly into that integrity piece.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting you say this. I feel that's definitely something that I'm actually learning a lot through relationships. And yeah, I think also like particularly alongside Emma, there's this like real being questioned and challenged. Like, dude, are you in your highest integrity? Like, what is going on here? Like, why does this thing trigger you? And it becomes this like really this vehicle for like massive like self-actualization in ways of like, man, there's a little bit of like pain or something unresolved, and there's a little bit, and then yeah, I feel continuously challenged in that space. And I feel what you touched on as well is this quality of creating specific environments for specific things. And I noticed so because I haven't been in Krav Maga for like a few months now, and like when I was doing it, I felt like, wow, this is the environment where it's like there's like physical contact, there is like that testing of boundaries, holding like my kind of safety zone and all that. And I noticed it has come through a few times, sort of like in my relationship with Emma, for example, where it's like, because I actually don't have that space where I'm actively going to meet other people in that, okay, let's test like where our like safety zones begin and end. And then it suddenly shows up in sort of like a different space, like in like my intimate relationship, where actually my real quest is to go deeper and deeper into coming together, rather than going further and further into like how far can I keep people out, And so I feel that, yeah, that responsibility that you brought up, I think, is a really big point of like, how do you, let's say, basically penetrate your world in creating these different pockets in which, yeah, I feel a certain part of, in my case, like my identity can be nurtured. And yeah, also like, how do you in your relationship or in your way of being create these pockets to do your motorcycle riding? And I mean, that's just kind of the thing, like how when you speak about this responsibility, how do you approach that so that you really deliberately create there?
On the back of when I think of, let's say, for instance, like Krav Maga or Kala that I've done, if I think about if there was a principle of what it does, or any martial arts for that matter, it's about management of chaos. When you're confronted with chaos, it's knowing how to manage chaos. And what you were saying before, that you didn't do it for a while, and then you go back into the relationship, and you're very aware that this one piece, this element is missing. I think it's very similar to that principle. When you go back into a relationship, it's knowing how to manage chaos. It's not about running away from chaos. It's not about being frightened by these things, because when you're training full well, someone punches you in the face, you're not going to run away and leave the class and cry. You're going to stay there and endure it and really face up to all these potential things, because there's so much learning that's going on involved in that session. And I think the moment we take that stance as men in seeing the beauty in the chaos that is the feminine, it gives us a different ability in being able to step into that and really hold that space. And I think what I mean by holding space as well is holding firm in our position as well, in knowing how to manage that, whether we want to accept it, whether we don't want to accept it, but being okay in whichever thing presents itself at that time. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I feel kind of like reframing the partnership to be, yeah, not the place of necessary comfort, but really being
Yeah.
one more container for evolution. And yeah, it can be at times really comfortable, and at other times it can be like, holy fuck, I just want to get away from here. But then kind of like staying with this. I mean, dude, I noticed that a lot when I cycle, for example. There's moments when it's like, yeah, this is all spectacular, and then there's moments when it's like, what the fuck. But these kind of like what the fuck moments, and being able to stay with that, or when there's like an emotional upset, like in the partnership, there's like, huh, actually, I did not vanish, and the thing resolved. And I mean, what's often my experience is like every sort of emotional upset actually deepens the bond, and in
Yeah.
that regard, I feel it's such a like crucial ingredient to connect more deeply. Is that your
Well,
experience? Or
I absolutely. I guess by doing that, where it does take you deeper into the experience, basically eliminates this fear of being eliminated, or completely, I guess, dissolved by the other, and I think, annihilated, for another word. And the minute you really do stick with that, and you do go deeper into the relationship, and you are able to surrender to that space, that that fear of being eliminated, at least for me, goes. And then it's all of a sudden this realization of, hey, I'm not going to be eliminated in this relationship if I do show myself, if I really am who I am. um, and vice versa. That really comes with the invitation to your partner to show her authentic self in that space. And and I think once both have seen the other, and I always say to myself, when I meet someone, I love spectacular people, but I also fear spectacular people in the same breath, because there's such a breadth of beautifulness about this human being, and in equal measure you have a lot of shit. And
mm,
it's knowing that you cannot have the one without the other, but it's just a question of when does the other arise, and can you be present and ride that. And I think if I eliminate that idea of being, fear of being eliminated, it makes it so much easier being able to meet that other side of that person, and equally show my side of that side.
it's really interesting, man. Earlier when I was walking on Arthur's Seat, the hill here in Edinburgh, I was speaking about this whole idea of um, yeah, elimination or annihilation. And it's kind of interesting because at times I really feel like, oh, I just want to like lean in all the way, and then I feel there's this moment of fear of like, whew, but what, and then like in moments when there's sort of like emotional upset and turmoil, like as soon as in these moments, because there's like two modes. I'm either going into the mode of like, oh fuck, I'm gonna lose everything and it's gonna like all fall apart and I'm gonna start from zero. And as long as I'm in that space, it's like it really like it festers, in the moment. And it often happens when I shower, it just kind of like washes it away, and it's like, actually I'm not attached, like if it falls apart, so may it be, let it
Yeah,
fall apart. And the moment this happens, it's like, oh, I feel that is sort of the precondition to actually coming back together in a, yeah, like more healthy. I think sort of the moment the non-attachment sets in to the relationship, it's like, actually, okay, I don't need it. I will be fine without it. And it's relating, I think, from that like really like masculine energy of I will be okay, rather than from this kind of childish boy energy of like, oh, I don't know if the world is gonna be okay if like I lose sort of like my mother figure in a way. And so I feel that's for me the big transition, moving away from sort of like a childish relating to the feminine, where it's more like a boy to a mother, to like a man to a woman. Just really like adult.
point, just to sort of step in there. It's like what Alan Watts says. The nature of love is self-abandonment. It's not about clinging on, and I think that's where this idea of non-attachment is so important for me, or at least studying yoga and yogic philosophy is something that's really central to my practice, because I think the more I practice non-attachment, the less pained I experience, or the less pained I am in life in general with a lot of things. And that really helps in the process of my surrendering. And it's not about sort of being detached. It's about actually really being as present as possible in whatever relational experience I'm going through. But not holding on to every single emotion that comes from those interactions, if that makes sense. It's Andy pointed out a question here. You spoke about balance achieved through boxing, and are you speaking about the value of conflict to go deeper? Boxing involves violence and potentially aggression. How do you see the role of violence and aggression in this process? I grew up in South Africa, where there's big debates about sort of crime and violence and things like that, and it's each person has their own experience. But my mom and sister got hijacked 3 times. My grandmother was attacked on her farm 3 times. Like this is real violence, and I just think with most of the men that I work with and I meet, we usually are afraid of being violent because society says that it's a bad thing being violent. But I think it's very much a important factor of knowing where our limit is in being able to push not only our mind into violence, our body into violence, but also knowing how to control that in being regulated enough to step away from a situation and use our heads rather than that violence, if that makes sense. But in order to do that, this is, I use boxing as one example. Yes, it's a very controlled frame for that. But like you talk about Krav Maga or the Kala system that I studied as well, this is a level of violence that's really based on reality. And I don't think our very cushioned lives ever give us that opportunity unless we're put into that kind of context. So I just think that there's something really important about knowing how to not only give yourself voice through aggression and knowing what that sounds like, just what happens when you bellow in anger, right? How does that person look? What comes up? How are you fueled by that? The same thing in being put in a position where you're actually allowed to strike somebody else. Like I said before, knowing full well that person's going to hit you back. But it's knowing what that feels like. It's like what is that relationship with that kind of pain? How does it trigger you? How does your brain work? There's so much information in that, and I think this is also a principle that should be used with women as well. Men and women should experience something like this, because then it gives you sort of perspective in knowing how to channel that and where to channel that. Whereas I guess moving from South Africa into coming to London, there's a completely different mindset in relation to that. It's almost like it's dampened down. You have to know how to control that and never allow that to come out. Provocation is, you just shy away. And then what usually happens in that kind of situation, if you are confronted, usually you turn against yourself and you feel ashamed because you didn't stand up for yourself. You didn't give yourself voice. You didn't actually stand your ground. You didn't do these things. And I'm not promoting violence by any way or any means here, but there does need to be a knowingness in yourself in knowing how and when to use that. And it's the same thing. Look, on a let's say, for instance, far more reduced level within the relationship with your partner. How is violence really interpreted? Violence is in language. Violence is in emotions. Violence is in actions. Now, I don't want any violence in my relationship, and this is really where I am controlled. But it's also knowing, okay, my partner in many respects is being violent towards me, or this is how I'm feeling and receiving them. There's so much information in that. It doesn't just have to be about the striking out of someone.
Maybe to build on this as well, I feel the conflict, to me, how I see how conflict helps the deepening of the relationship is that conflict triggers a certain conversation, and it brings awareness to but why does this thing upset you? What is it in it that has sort of an emotional charge? And I feel it often sort of highlights a childhood wound that actually has the opportunity to be healed in these moments. And I feel also on this sort of like whole kind of violence and aggression. To me, for attraction to maintain, there needs to be a clarity of two poles. And with that, I think it's really important to know like what is my space and what is the space that I'm defending in some way. And there's, I feel, the like a conscious choice of choosing sort of like difference from my partner. But then there's also the other piece of, yeah, what if I become more fluid and no longer sort of like hold on to this thing and no longer need to defend or anything, and then kind of like this whole violence component disappears. But I think it's part of that spectrum. Like in order to see the light, I feel that there needs to be the darkness. And also I feel within violence is really it's a level of like real, like a test of power, like how it's kind of an interesting one, like how destructive can I become? Because then I also know like how creative or constructive I can become.
I guess one thing for me that I try and sort of practice right now is try and eliminate this idea of masculine and feminine, and just it's a state of being. Now, what is my general state of being that I want to embody in relation to my partner? Because yes, of course, within them they have the masculine and feminine interplay as well. So it's really how can I sit with all these things that flood through me, emotions, thoughts, ways of being, and using what you were saying before, Toby, like really use that space of disagreement and conflict to reflect back but reflect back in a way that you're aiming to step back in again. So something that I always think that is vital in relationships is, once there is that conflict that comes together, what do you do there afterwards? For me, what's really important is going straight back in again. And most people are so sensitive to that space, and they don't want to experience those emotional wounds that they carry, and that whether they're informed by their child, the child position, the adult position, it makes no difference. It's really that stepping back in or stepping towards that partner that creates a deeper trust. And it's there, I think it's really knowing where that tension point is and feeling that space, that a lot of work can be done where you actually do go a lot deeper. And it builds a lot more closeness.
I think it's interesting when you say stepping in. I want to say one thing, and then let's move to the other question that Andy had asked. Because the interesting thing, like with boxing or anything, there is, there is that level of impact. There's contact. There's force involved in a way, and I feel I'm noticing that for me, conflict often arises when I'm not leaning into the partnership, but when I'm sort of like, okay, I'm fully retreating, I'm doing sort of my own thing in my own world. And then is when the conflict arises, because I feel there is this interesting thing with like partnership, that there wants to be sort of like contact. And if there's no contact, then it's like, oh, I need to lean further in order to...
It's wake up.
Yeah, wake up, be here, be present, And so I feel there is, especially if in the relationship context where the like underlying proposition is like, look, we are here because we love each other, we want to be with one another. And for me in these moments, it's then like, look, you're actually not here. You're sort of like in your little dream world or somewhere. Come back. And so there's this almost like conflict as a connection tool to just like sink in on a deeper level together.
I guess what would be really interesting with something like that is, instead of sort of honing in on the conflict within the couple, actually adding the narrative, I don't feel you. If that makes sense. So it's exactly, the moment.
Yeah, right. It's like,
and that works both ways. It's I don't feel you right now. And if that comes from, let's take sex as an example. do you ever ask that question when sex is involved? It's usually you want to eroticize that portion of the relationship and feel the body and feel connected and do all those different things and use the sexual experience as the connection. But how many times is our head absent from that actual experience? Probably many times, and that works both sides. Whereas if we were holding each other accountable and going, I don't feel you right now, how different would that be? It's that really adds tension to the sexual relationship.
Yeah, it's a moment of listening. Yeah, dude, totally. Okay, so Andy had another question. So you mentioned the sexual metaphor of penetration. Why do you feel that the sexual metaphor is appropriate to describe all levels of action? In your study, have you considered alternative stories of what drives masculinity in the world?
Oh, dude, I mean, I think for me, penetration is really about creation more than anything else. It's you can take penetration out the picture. I do, and I know this is very reductionist in nature too, but I do think that a central part of all men is creation. It's just a question of where you place that. On a very reductionist level, our semen is the starting point of creation, right? So it's if we can sort of embody that and go, okay, I am a creator of my world. I want to penetrate this world. I want to engage, and I want to be more than what I am in my journey of building something. You've tapped into an endless source of power, an endless source of invigoration. There's just so much there that's untapped, and I feel that a lot of men don't tap in. That's the thing that I encounter most. It's almost like we teeter along the edges of that rather than actually embodying that 100%.
Yeah, and I feel when you speak about this penetration idea, because it's an interesting one, because there's the semen, but without the egg, nothing happens.
It's
And I feel
100%.
this is like the interesting piece where it's really like integrating the masculine into the feminine in a way, where I mean I see it a lot in my relationship as well, is that there is that creative interplay of there's an idea from Emma, and then sort of like, for example, with the house, I mean, she had the structure and I had like the impetus and then most of the work, and actually to make it like what's now a family home, and so it's the piece of really coming together in union and sort of like a collective vision of like, but because there's these two different energies, and I mean even like in like while having sex, I mean it's in a way quite violent, like when you look at these little like semen
Penetration is
swimmer,
violent. Yeah.
they are like infiltrating, they are going like through all the layers of defense, from like all the vaginal mucus to all the other like pH barriers and blah blah blah, until in the end, boom, like one makes it, hopefully. And so it is really quite interesting that there is like conflict before something new arises. It's almost like creating new elements where you shoot like photons onto it. It's kind of like nuclear like fission, no fusion actually. And so you're creating kind of like new, higher level, more like valuable elements by basically an infiltration of a boundary, which is kind of like a really interesting thing. And I think on the sort of like relationship dynamic, in a way, it comes back to this idea of like annihilation, where again, sort of like the masculine kind of like gets annihilated within the feminine, or maybe kind of sort of the other way around, I don't know. But it's I feel also in terms of like business projects or something, I'm beginning to see more and more, or even if I just build something, I need to change the world, and there's sort of like lovingly, aggressively, whatever, but there is sort of like me moving particles, and there is there is that shaping of the outside world. And I think also the sort of the creation of space in a way, because like for a business project there needs to be room for it to grow. It's just like when last year I built all these like flower raised beds, and then Emma was the one who puts in the seeds. So but it's like, okay, like create the space and then
Well, it's the
it
co-creation.
can grow. Yeah, absolutely, man.
It's something I was thinking is that, I guess not all men want to go on that journey of mass creation, or at least on a huge level. But I just think that, that act of creation is happening within your world too, in the sense that, every single time you come together with your partner and make love and penetrate, and there is that coming together of two bodies and minds and souls, you are creating anew, because you are different through the act of actually making love to your partner. It's not the same every single time, even though, let's say, for instance, you have a very, very basic sex life, same missionary position every single time. But that act of actually penetrating your partner and being together and tapping and coming together as a source of union there, it changes your whole life all the time. And I think a lot of the time we're also quite neglectful of the beauty and the simplicity of the relationship. And I think that's unfortunate that we overlook that. And I think that comes with some training. The more mindful you are, the more present you become, and you can see these nuances. And something I always say to everyone I work with is just really be curious. The more curious you are in all these interactions, be curious how you're reacting. Be curious how you're feeling your partner. Be curious how your partner's acting. There's so much information all the time, and I just don't really agree with this idea that things stay the same. Everything is in a constant state of flux all the time. So, in theory, then you can't really be bored if you're being curious with your partner all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that curiosity and that continues, like, who are you now? Who are you today? That's I feel where really longevity comes in, rather than having that sort of like fixed mental construct. And maybe that also relates back to some of the other comments that Andy was here sharing in the chat, where it's still continued on that idea of violence, and so finding the way, or the kind of the line between personal growth and then sort of like understanding societal violence. I feel for me it's a really like fine balance, because I would say, so in Nietzschean Buddhism, kind of the like spiritual practice that I am currently exploring, there's one of these sayings that there is no violent or peaceful land, but the quality of the heart of the people live there make it either like a tranquil, peaceful land, or a land full of like violence and hellish actions. And I feel that basically comes back here in the conversation as well, where it's not really societal violence or society, like how are they able to manage sort of like their own inner conflicts, and is the conflict projected outside and blaming someone else, like you.
So you can't hear you. Sorry about the technical difficulty. I wonder if anyone else is experiencing the same thing. Well, if we don't hear back from him, then it seems like we're coming to a close for the session. So let's just maybe give it a minute or two, and let's see if Toby comes back. Well, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that actually joined us today. I know that this has just basically bounced onto so many different ideas, and I hope it was at least a little bit informative on some level. So next week I'm going to be interviewing Toby, and from there we have some really, really, really exciting people that we're going to have in our conversations, and just I'm super excited for all of this, and just really hope you guys are too. Doesn't look like he's coming back, so there we go.
It does indeed. Mate, this is interesting. The power of technology. Okay, yeah, and thanks for taking this over, brother. That was good. Yeah, the last thing I was saying here, to just pick up on this is really that I have these two choices when I'm triggered, because I feel that's sort of like what I see in relationships. It's really a vehicle to kind of like disconnect the triggers that we hold. And choice number one is that I get triggered, I feel angry, I feel pissed off, I feel like, oh, I don't want to feel this, and then just like push the other person away, which is fully like externalizing all the emotion. It's like, actually, it doesn't do anything for me. Like all it does, it creates like disconnection, it creates disharmony, it creates conflict. And I'm still having that inner charge of, or that inner wound, that inner pain. And the other choice is that I'm sort of like trusting in the strength of the relationship and actually allow myself to like feel like, why am I irritated? Like, what is the sadness that's underneath this? Like, what's sort of like the early child disappointment that I potentially experienced, or in which way am I not feeling met? And so in sort of that second version, that trigger, that initial conflict, actually, if my intention is to connect and heal, and if my inner knowing is, okay, I'm stable enough to just feel whatever emotion I'm feeling and I'm not dissolving by the emotion, then yeah, that's the end of it. It's basically like every time I get triggered, it's like, yes, thanks for triggering me. That gives me another opportunity to disconnect. And so a friend of mine, Adam, he has this metaphor that, basically the masculine and the feminine is kind of like these two poles, and they pull towards one another, ultimately wanting to
fuse.
Like just fuse, yeah. But the thing is, like, before you can come together here in the middle is this like core wound where, I come with wounds, like Emma comes with wounds. We all have our like wounds from when we were younger. And like while we get pulled together, we tap into that wound. And then instead of when we tap in being like, you made me feel this way, it's like, okay, something's coming up for me. Maybe need a moment, or I need to process it, or can you hold me, or I mean, whatever it is that I need to do in that moment to kind of like feel safe and recognize that it has nothing to do with her or with, let's say, the other person that has triggered me, but it's all to do with that there is something in me that I have experienced, that I have just like pushed away out of my conscious experience into some sort of like subconscious pattern. And the moment, and for me, the most powerful way there is really just breathing and really just like feeling sort of, and I feel like at the moment, and it comes back to this curiosity piece, not just being curious about your partner, but being curious about like, holy shit, man, like I am a community of like 50 trillion cells. So how do these things like work with one another, and being curious about that state of being alive.
Dude, but the problem with something like this is that don't take me wrong, I've been culprit to this as well in my past relationships, where when something feels too painful, it's almost the exit is the only way, rather than actually sort of reprogramming yourself and saying, well, you have an amazing opportunity now to see the depths of how far this will go, right? And I always really believe this, that, if you don't deal with something, it's just going to repeat in the next relationship. So you might as well deal with it right now, so that when you are in the next relationship, if it does lead to that next relationship, it's going to be something different, and it'll be a different kind of depth. So I just see that as a real opportunity, instead of giving yourself that exit. And please don't take me wrong, it's not saying that we shouldn't exit from relationships, but it's more a question of being very honest with ourselves that we've done enough work in stepping towards the other. And, if you are stepping towards that integrous self of, that you carry within you, and we're all capable of doing this, you do find that answer. You do find, is it worthwhile for me being in this? Do I want to be in this? Are we still learning from each other? Can we journey together? And it just kind of gives you a different frame of relating and not using past narratives. I think that's a big thing. Love the way how you face up to that, dude.
It's a constant practice.
Yeah, it's every
There are
day.
days that I'm worse at other days, you know. I think it also depends on like the, let's say, the magnitude of the trigger. And I feel it also depends on, I will say I'm really, really fortunate in terms of, I feel also, yeah, just the partnership that I'm in right now. Because it feels that both of us are really committed to being connected, and both of us are really committed to our own journeys. And I mean, totally, you know, I see the patterns from like my past 2 relationships. They resurface, and it's like, boom, you know, is I either fix this or it's gonna be in my 4th relationship the fucking same story. You know, like it's not that it will ever change, but it's now, you know, and it's like, do I lean in or do I lean out?
It's a little bit like this I guess this ideology of karma that I have in my head. I want to do the work now so that if this does exist and there is karma and I have to come back to another dharma and relive this, I don't want to relive the same shit. So I might as well do all the work right now and actually benefit from that if it is going to be coming later. But it gives me a different relationship in stepping back in, that I don't have to be so focused on loss and what I call lower level emotions and all the shame and the guilt and all the other things that are intertwined, you know, stemming from past traumas. It's just an amazing opportunity to, like you say, be curious and see what comes up. Yeah, who comes up?
I mean, one of my mentors, you know, he was saying like, look, it's not the woman, like it's you. Are you capable enough to like handle that relationship? And it's just like, wow. And every woman is sort of like a sliver of like the divine feminine, you know, and it's not like change the woman and then suddenly the relationship is different. It's like, okay, change how you're showing up in relation to the feminine beings, and then your relationships are going to be different. Yeah, it's going to be exciting. So Massimo, I mean, you already shared earlier, okay, well, over the next 12 months, most likely every Monday, unless something like horrendous will happen, we are going to have these conversations. Next week we'll swap roles, and then yeah, we're sending out more emails about the upcoming themes and the speakers, most likely always at the end of the month, so that you're kind of like have a journey plan for the month ahead, who will be our guest and the topics that we're exploring. So yeah, amazing. Michael and Andy, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being inquisitive and sharing questions and thoughts. It's always super exciting to yeah, because our objective here is to make it super applied, and we're also having the capacity to bring people on stage with us. So potentially in the coming weeks, what we'll do is to yeah, give you an opportunity to ask you questions live, and we can have a bit more of a like on stage debate, as I feel that ultimately creates so much beautiful learning.
And fundamentally building a community where none of us know what is right or wrong, but at least we're figuring it out.
That's it. All right, beautiful humans, have an awesome week, and we'll see you again next week.
Absolutely.
Massimo, my man.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for being here. Take care. Bye.
Bye.